This lecture for AP Environmental Science is about island biogeography. Island biogeography is topic 2.3. The enduring understanding is that ecosystems have structure and diversity that change over time. And the learning objectives just be able to describe island biogeography and describe the role of island biogeography in evolution. And we'll talk about the essential knowledge at the end, as usual. Here's the vocab, which you can pause and write down. So if we break down this term, island biogeography, what are we talking about? Well, first off, islands. Those are any body of land surrounded by water, and they are, of course, going to range greatly in terms of size, in terms of isolation, and whether they are surrounded by fresh or salt water. And the second part of this term, biogeography, we can break that down into its root words, bio meaning life or living things, and geography, essentially where things are, so placement of things around the Earth. And with this, we're talking about where species or biomes exist through space and time on the planet. Okay, that's going to essentially be your species distribution, and it's going to be affected by climate, geography, the evolutionary history of those groups, and abiotic and biotic factors. So for example, climate, you're not going to be able to grow tropical plants outside of the tropics. So you're not going to be able to grow palm trees up in the North Pole. Okay. Geography, very similar. There's going to be geographic barriers that affect species distribution. We're going to talk about a lot of those with islands later on, and evolutionary history. So the best example I think for that is marsupials, and why marsupials are only found on the continents of Australia and the associated islands that are east of Wallace's line, as well as South America and just one species in North America. There's an evolutionary history that those groups have, and they have never, that they're just not found or never existed on Africa or Eurasia. Okay, so there's that evolutionary history piece. So the theory of island biogeography was developed in the 1960s by Edward O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur, and it's also called the species equilibrium model, the insular biogeography, island biogeography. It has a lot of different names. Whenever you see that term insular, think isolated, and typically think islands, but technically speaking, it means isolated. Okay, this describes species richness, the evolutionary diversity, and the community structures of islands and other island-like habitats. We'll talk about what those are later on, based on geographic characteristics of that island. Whether the island is small or large, whether it is close or far from the mainland are the two biggest things. Species richness is going to be determined by the island's size and distance from the mainland, like I just said, and this compares the rate of immigration to the rate of extinction on that island. So let's imagine a hypothetical situation where we have islands off of the coast of the mainland. Okay, we have a large island, we have a small island, we have a medium or small island that is near to the mainland, and we have a medium or small island that is far from the mainland. I'll just call it small islands. Okay, and then if we think about species randomly moving from the mainland to those islands, that's often going to be random distribution. You might have mammals that can swim a very short distance, but they won't be able to swim a very far distance. They will drown before they get there. You could have freak incidences of rafting. So say that there is a storm and there's an iguana that is clinging to a tree. That tree along the coast, that tree gets downed and it gets washed out to the sea. There is a greater chance of it just drifting and hitting a big island than drifting and hitting a small island. Okay, and that iguana may live if it finds a big island. It may not live if it just drifts out into the ocean forever, because it'll eventually starve or succumb to dehydration. Think of it kind of like throwing darts. It's going to be easier to hit a big target. It's going to be easier to hit a target that is closer to you than further away. Okay? So immigration rate is going to be dependent on the island size. Larger islands are going to have a more diverse community because they are a larger target for those species to hit. You might have an iguana that can make it over. You might have a rat that can make it over. You might have an elephant that can make it over. You might have, different assemblage of organisms rather than this small island where these other species might miss it. Maybe you just get the iguana. That's going to have a more diverse community. Plus, a large island is going to support a wider range of habitats. You could have changes in elevation that create many different types of habitat. Maybe you have a rain shadow on one side that's going to create a dry area and a wet area. You're going to have a lot of different types of habitat on a large island. And then on a small island, you won't have a very wide range of habitats at all. And the extreme of that would just be a pinnacle of rock sticking out of the ocean where you just have one type of habitat, which is just the bare rock. The distance again from the mainland and other islands is also a contributing factor. Again, for random dispersal, if it's closer to the mainland, it's going to easily accept new species are easily going to find it. And if it's further away from the mainland, it's going to be harder. Now you can also have this idea of island hopping. So from the mainland to the first island and then from that island to another island. But again, the chances of survival are going to diminish the more times that you hop. Okay, so the immigration rate is going to get smaller. And then we can look at different taxonomic groups. Different groups of organisms are better at migrating to islands than other groups of organisms. For example, plants with wind-dispersed seeds are going to be much better at migrating than plants to the island than plants that require mammals to disperse their seeds. Plants that require birds to disperse their seeds may get onto that island a little bit easier because birds can easily make that cross that water, right? Especially if it's a seabird or any type of water bird. Arthropods can typically fly, so they're going to find the islands a little bit easier. Birds we think of as mostly being able to fly, so they're going to make it. Marine mammals, a seal can just very easily swim from the mainland to any island. Okay, they're going to migrate the easiest. Reptiles kind of have a medium distribution. If you think about the log example, and this does happen, reptiles have such a slow metabolism and they can go very long periods without water, so they can survive drifting out in the ocean a lot longer than other groups. Amphibians, they can't really handle salt water at all, so they have a very tough time distributing, but they can do it. And non-marine mammals are also going to have a tough time dispersing because they have such a faster metabolism. Okay. And then we can compare that we can contrast that with the extinction rate. This is typically going to, like all groups have a background extinction rate. So there's always going to be dispersal to an island and there's always going to be species going extinct, but the immigration rate and the extinction rate are going to more or less balance out to where you have a more or less stable number of species on an island. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Large islands, again, are going to have more varied habitat. They're going to have more resources, so extinction rate's going to be lower. That's what we see on this large island. And this one's even further from the mainland, so it's going to have a lower immigration rate than the smaller island, but still there's going to be more species that are able to survive on it because there's more different types of habitat. Small islands have fewer resources, so competition is going to be higher. Extinction is therefore going to be higher. So it really depends on the island's size, more so than where it is in relation to the mainland. The relation to the mainland really influences immigration rate and not extinction rate. So we could mathematically model this, but we're not really going to for our class. We just need to know the concepts, okay? We just need to know it conceptually. So most diversity is going to occur on large islands that are just offshore. They're more easily colonized because they're just offshore, and they're large islands, so they're going to have a variety of habitats, so extinction rate's going to be low. So high immigration rate and low extinction rate. Least diversity is going to occur on small isolated islands, so you're going to have a low immigration rate, and you're going to have a, low immigration rate is for the isolated bit, and you're going to have a high extinction rate. Okay. Diversity is going to be highest in plants, arthropods, birds, and marine mammals. And that's what we see for islands all across the globe, especially if they're isolated. It's really the birds and the marine mammals that are going to be well represented, especially migratory seabirds and marine mammals, including seals and sea lions. And it's going to be lowest in terrestrial mammals. Terrestrial mammals have a really tough time in getting to islands. Okay. And we can think about this graphically. So we have number of species on the x-axis, increasing number of species going from left to right, and then the rate of whether we're talking about colonization in this orangish color or extinction in this greenish color. So if we just think about colonization having to do with a close or remote island, if it's closer, it's going to have a higher rate of colonization up here than if it is more isolated. And an island that is large is going to have a lower extinction rate than an island that is small. Okay, and these will typically intersect, or sorry, they won't typically intersect, but they will intersect. So number of species, you can predict the number of species based off of how close the island is and how large that island is. And then same thing with a small isolated island. And you can literally put in numbers for these parameters and determine where on this graph these are going to intersect and where the number of species are. So it could be that it is a really close island that is really big and they have a lot of species, or a really remote island that is very, very small, and they're going to have a very few number of species. Okay, so we can think about this graphically. And then once those species do get to the islands, there typically is going to be many unoccupied niches. That's especially true if we're thinking about newly islands that are newly created, either through volcanism or islands that have recently been revealed due to drops in sea level. There's going to be lots of unoccupied niches. So whatever colonizers get there first tend to rapidly evolve into different species to fill those different niches. And that, as you should remember from biology, is the process of adaptive radiation. Okay, that's going to lead to high species diversity, but very low phylogenetic diversity. So an example of that would be the birds on the Galapagos. You really have a couple different groups of birds. You have a wide array of finch species, and then you have a slightly smaller or much smaller array of magpies. And those finches and magpies were the first birds to get to the island, or at least get to the island and do very well, be successful on the islands, and they radiated out into those numerous species to fill many unoccupied niches. Okay, but there is high species diversity. There's going to be lots of types of Darwin's finches. There's lots of species of Darwin's finches, but they have low phylogenetic diversity because they all evolved from the same common ancestor. So another example of that is Hawaii. Hawaii is a very isolated group of islands. They are very far from the North American mainland, very far from Eurasia and Australia. Many species did come from Asia because they were riding the trade winds, the prevailing winds going from west to east. The honey creepers are an example of that. There were dozens of species. At least 20 of them have been driven to extinction due to human activity. Here is some representatives of those, and you can see the variety of beak shape adapted for different niches. So you have ones that feed on nectar, as well as being a little bit of a generalist, that are not competing with other ones for nectar because this bill is adapted for certain flower types, flower structures, whereas these bills are adapted for other ones, kind of a medium flower, long flower, and short flowers. Okay, very similar to the beaks of Darwin's finches, adapted for different things. You have beaks for small prey, then you have beaks for, again, nectar and generalists, and small prey and fruits and seeds. All these beaks adapted for different things, and you have these birds distributed on different islands. So they have radiated out from a common ancestor. Similar example with silver swords and the fruit flies. The fruit flies of Hawaii are extremely varied. They fill tons of niches that other insects fill in other areas of the world. You have more traditional fruit flies like this one down here that you can probably not see very well. That's probably normal fruit fly size. And then you have really crazy, highly adapted, very specialized derived fruit flies that are doing more normal fly things. Like when I say normal flies, not what fruit flies typically do, just going after fruit, but what a house fly would do. And they're doing all kinds of weird stuff on Hawaii. There's about 800 species of fruit flies, all adapted for different niches. Okay, I mentioned the Galapagos. Madagascar is another great example, isolated for a very long time. Lemurs, there's about 101 extant species, but there are extinct species of giant lemurs that were like gorilla-sized, that were filling like the same niche as a gorilla on the mainland. They have about 75 species of chameleons, a lot of diversity there. So once species get to islands, again, they can radiate out into all of these different forms to fill all these unoccupied niches. And because we're talking about islands, I want to take a couple sidetracks. The first is talking about relic species. Some ancient islands like New Caledonia, which you can see circled over here, Australia for reference, can act as reservoirs or refugia for genetic diversity by harboring these relic species. And a relic species is a species that was once very widely distributed, but now exists in very small habitat, or a very small fraction of its former habitat. So an example that you may be familiar with are the coastal redwoods in California. The coastal redwoods can only be found along the California coast, whereas they used to exist throughout much of North America. Right now, they are only isolated to the very small strip of coastal California, and that's all due to natural causes. It's due to competitive exclusion, it's due to changes in climate, changes in habitat, and all of that stuff. Okay, New Caledonia is a great example. Like I said, the richness of diversity. This is the richest diversity of plants in the world per square kilometer, and it includes some really ancient lineages. So the oldest lineage of angiosperms, so the oldest lineage of flowering plants anywhere on the planet, 43 endemic conifers and their closely related allies that have these really weird shapes. So if we think about normal gymnosperms, what we tend to think of are pines and other conifers. It also includes the cycads and the ginkgos. They were very prevalent during the Mesozoic, not as prevalent nowadays, but the species richness here is huge for gymnosperms. It includes the world's largest fern species, which is this tree fern, and contains entire genera, families, and even orders that are found nowhere else on the planet. So New Caledonia is a harbor for genetic diversity. And one of the coolest consequences of living on island can be island gigantism or island dwarfism. This is due to limited resources, lack of predators, limited competition, and species are kind of free to evolve in different forms. What you typically have is small species like a pigeon, which would be about this big, evolving into giant flightless pigeons, the dodo, or small rabbits evolving into these giant rabbits that probably couldn't hop. This happened on some Mediterranean islands. Essentially what happened is a small species found themselves on island with plenty of resources, plenty of food, and they just get larger and larger over time, and they typically don't have any predators. So they don't have that pressure, in the rabbit's case, to remain small, agile, fast, with great ears for hearing, and all of that stuff. So they get really large with evolutionary time. The opposite happens when a typically large species finds itself isolated on an island as well. So with hippos and elephants, this again happened in the Mediterranean. And we have things like pygmy hippos and pygmy elephants, where a large species finds itself isolated on an island with very few resources, and it just gets smaller and smaller over evolutionary time to fit those niches a little bit better because there's less food on those small islands. So really cool evolutionary things can happen on islands. All right, so back to the course curriculum, endemics. An endemic species is a species that's found in only one place. And we can describe these endemics as either narrow endemics or broad endemics. So an example of a narrow endemic would be the yellow-bibbed parrot that's on the Solomon Islands. It's only on a few islands off of, you can see where it is, where the Solomon Islands are based off of New Guinea and Australia, so east of New Guinea. They're a very narrow endemic. They only exist in a very small geographic range versus a broad endemic, which exists over a very wide geographic range. You can see like the tiny pinprick of the Solomon Islands on this versus, sorry, that was an errand. This tiny pinprick of the Solomon Islands versus the distribution of the ring kangaroo on Australia. Okay, they have a much wider distribution. but they're still endemic, still only found in one place on the planet, only Australia. Okay. Due to the isolation of islands and the evolutionary history on those islands, there's going to be a high percentage of endemics on islands. Islands have the highest percentage of endemics relative to any other landmass on the planet. Okay, species are constantly evolving, constantly radiating, and constantly going extinct on islands, but they're constantly forming new species through the process of evolution. Plus, we have those relic species like we discussed with New Caledonia. Okay, so there is a very large proportion of endemics on islands, meaning that if something were to happen to the yellow-bibbed woodpecker on the Solomon Islands, say that there's an introduced species that ate the yellow-bibbed woodpecker eggs and didn't allow them to hatch, or there was habitat destruction that ruined the habitat of the yellow-bibbed woodpecker. Sorry, I said woodpecker twice. I meant parrot. Sorry, yellow-bibbed parrot. That would completely remove the species from the planet. All right, due to the evolutionary history on islands and due to the fact that we have this process of adaptive radiation, we typically get lots of specialists on islands. They're specialized for a single type of food resource, which you can see with the diversity of the Galapagos finches, of the Darwin finches on the Galapagos Islands. They're adapted for specific food types, most of them, so that they can partition those resources. So they reduce competition. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of specialists on islands. And as you should recall, specialists have a greater chance of going extinct if environmental conditions change. So if the conditions on the islands change, any one of these that are specialists, such as the vegetarian finch, or sorry, maybe a better example would be the large ground finch. They can only eat large nuts or large seeds. They are going to go extinct if the conditions change to plants that only produce small seeds being favored. Okay, so specialists tend to be on islands, and they tend to go extinct if conditions change. They also tend to go extinct when generalists are introduced. So rats are a great example. Rats have been wrecking biodiversity on islands throughout the world due to the accidental introduction of them since the 16, 17, 1800s, and they outcompete many of the native species on those islands. Okay, so they can go extinct in that way as well by the introduction of generalists. So that's what this slide is mostly discussing. The introduction of predators have led to the biodiversity on islands plummeting. Many species have gone extinct due to the introduction of predators. Many species on islands have evolved for hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of years in the absence of predators. So they have no natural defensive strategies for predators. So they have no camouflage, they have no fear, they have no evasive actions, they have no poisons that they create or that they secrete, and predators can easily eat them. For example, the dodos are a classic example of this. You have tales of people that could just walk up to a dodo, smack it on the head with a club and kill it, and then walk up to the next one that just saw its buddy get killed, and then smack it on the head and kill it with a club. Okay, that happens with a lot of different bird species on a lot of different islands because they have what we call ecological naivete. They are naive to predators. Okay, but rats, pigs, goats, cats, dogs, mongoose are the biggest introduced predators on islands. Okay, we think about cats and dogs as pets, but they become feral on islands. I think I did list goats. Goats are not predators, they're herbivores. They eat and basically any plant available, and they overgraze islands, and they lead to competition for browsing from the native species. Okay, but the predators here being rats, pigs, cats, and dogs. And yes, pigs will eat meat if they can. So a textbook example of that is the brown tree snake on Guam. This was accidentally introduced during World War II as a stowaway on a ship, probably inside of crates. And there's no native snake species on Guam. All of the bird species on Guam have no idea what a snake is. They have never encountered a snake during their lifetime or during their evolutionary history. The brown tree snake has no competitors. It has no predators on the island. So there's no predators to keep that brown tree snake in check. There's no predators that will eat that snake. Okay. Since its introduction, it's led to the extinction of 10 of the 11 native bird species on Guam. So 10 of the 11 bird species on this tiny island of Guam have gone extinct. Many native plants are pollinated by those birds, so their populations are not being replenished. If they can't be pollinated, they won't set seed and they won't create the new generation. Okay, that can lead to entire ecosystem collapse. Plus, you have small mammal populations that are also crashing. There's a few small mammals that are native to Guam, and they're being eaten by the snakes as well. And at one point, there was an average of 13,000 snakes per square mile on Guam. So they are really, really, really prevalent on the island. There is active campaigns to hunt them and eradicate them, but that's really difficult because they are tree snakes. They do live in the trees, plus they are nocturnal. The clue for that is their giant eyes. They see very well in the dark. Plus, they, like all snakes, can sense chemicals in the air by flicking their tongue. Most of the birds are diurnal. In fact, all the birds are diurnal. So they're just sitting there roosting on the tree, on the branch of the tree, sleeping when the snake comes up and eats them. Okay, so the bird has no natural defenses against the snakes. So one cool thing about the theory of island biogeography is that it applies to other non-island islands, in quotes. Okay, so think about species distribution from one island to another. Again, we can model that mathematically or just qualitatively based off of the distance of that island from one island to the another or one island to the mainland, and based off of the size of the new island. Okay, this one on the right over here. And we see that the species composition is not as rich on this island as it is on this island. We can do the same type of modeling with these other types of habitat. Alpine zones are essentially islands of high ground above tree line in a sea of low ground below tree line. So if you have a plant that is only adapted to living on the alpine zone and cannot tolerate being shaded by trees, it's going to have a very difficult time distributing over to this isolated island of habitat, this isolated mountaintop, if it doesn't have adaptations to do so. So if it's wind dispersed, it may find an easier route over there, but if it is dispersed through the feces of a mammal that only lives in the alpine zone, a mammal that lives in the alpine zone isn't going to make this walk all the way through the valley, through the forest to this other alpine zone, so it will never disperse the seeds of that plant over there. Ponds are another great example, so we just completely reverse the island idea. Rather than land being surrounded by water, this is water surrounded by land. If there's no creeks and no rivers and no streams running into and out of these ponds, a fish is going to have a very tough time getting from one isolated piece of habitat to another isolated piece of habitat. Okay, without some specific adaptations to do so, and without something like a flood that totally inundates this entire area so that they can move freely from one pond to another. And then when the waters recede, then they're left isolated again. But assuming none of that happens, a fish is going to have a very tough time hopping from one pond to another that's pretty isolated from it. Okay, and the same thing with isolated forests. A species like, say, a monkey, some species of monkeys spend their entire lives in the trees. Maybe a better example would be an orangutan, so an ape. Orangutans spend virtually their entire life in the treetops. So a species that's going to spend its entire life in the treetops is not going to go down to the grassy floor and walk all the way over on the ground to this isolated patch of forest. So orangutans will be isolated and stuck in this isolated forest. Okay. We add climate change on top of that, and some of these islands are shrinking, specifically alpine habitats. So we have on the left conditions now, and then on the right conditions with increasing global temperatures. So forest line is going to increase up the mountain, and this patch of habitat is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until finally there is completely forested mountaintops, and these species that are adapted for the alpine tundra possibly go extinct. And another example is habitat fragmentation. Again, this creates islands of suitable habitat that are surrounded by roads, by agriculture, by development, etc. Okay, so this is going to both reduce the habitat size and isolate patches of habitat from one another. And it's going to create a loss of genetic diversity. So let me explain using the chimpanzee example over here on the bottom left. So we have this map of chimpanzee habitat status from 2000 to 2003 on the left and 2010 to 2012 on the right. And we can see the green being good chimpanzee habitat. And we can see some parks that are outlined. So it's going to be really easy for chimpanzees to distribute from one park to a next and interbreed with one another. Whereas if we create these patches of habitat, the chimpanzees are not going to go from this patch of habitat to that patch of habitat as easily because they have to traverse all of that open ground, which they don't like to do. And this population has effectively become isolated from this population, and this population, and this population are all isolated from one another. And because of that, inbreeding is going to increase, and you're going to have the deleterious or the negative effects of inbreeding in each one of these populations. So they can't migrate between one another, and they're cutting off gene flow and increasing the incidence of inbreeding, and you get inbreeding depression in those populations. Okay. It's also going to create greater edge effect. And the edge effect is our last vocab word. This is essentially the population or community structure around the edges of habitat, and that's going to be very different from the center of that habitat. Okay, so the tree composition and the other plant composition in the center of a forest is going to be very different from what exists on the edges. On the edges, the plants are going to be adapted for greater sunlight and for this intermediary transitionary boundary between forest and, in this case, grassland. Okay, it could be grassland and desert, it could be tundra and forest, it could be, anything really, just two different types of habitat. The ones I'm showing here are just forest and grassland. Okay. And the consumer populations are also going to differ around the edges. So, for example, red deer really like to live on the edges. They like to eat the plants that are on the edge, and they like to be able to see out on the grassland for any predators, and then have the forest to run and hide in. Okay, so they move very effectively between forest and grassland habitats. Some species, though, prefer to just live in the very center of the forest. And they're going to be negatively impacted as the forest gets chopped up into smaller pieces, as it's fragmented, and all that you have left are little corridors, and these corridors on this image are probably following rivers or streams. And the species composition is going to change because you're increasing the amount of edge. You're increasing the amount of transition between one habitat and the other. You're increasing the amount of surface area on the side of the forest, and therefore increasing the edge effect. Okay, so some species are going to benefit from that, but more species prefer to live in the middle of the forest, and they're going to be negatively impacted by increased edge effect. Okay. So that's all I have for you guys. If you are not in class, we're going to watch this in class, but if you're not going to be there, watch this video. The video is both linked in Schoology and in the description below. Okay, so to the essential knowledge. Island biogeography is the study of ecological relationships and distribution of organisms on islands and of these organisms' community structures. So we're talking about what species typically are found on islands and the relative proportions of those species. So species diversity on islands. Islands have been colonized in the past by new species arriving from elsewhere. So we're talking about immigration rate in that piece of essential knowledge. Okay, and then many island species have evolved to be specialists versus generalists because of limited resources such as food and territory on most islands. The long-term survival of specialists may be jeopardized if and when invasive species, which are typically generalists, are introduced and outcompete those specialists. Okay, so there's a lot here with island biogeography. Hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you all in class.